In today's video, we're going to be looking at 5 different types of infographic animations. Super simple, super great way of visualizing data and telling a story. We're going to be looking at a phase animation, a box chart, pie chart, a pyramid, and last but not least, probably everyone's favorite, a map animation. Without further ado, let's hop straight into After Effects, where I have a couple of different compositions set up already. All of them 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second to keep it nice and simple. The first infographic animation we're going to be tackling is the phase animation, and in this case, it's going to be showing the phases that coffee beans go through until you drink it. I've already found the assets. I've just gone on Google and found some assets that I thought would work for this example. But before we drag in our assets, I want to create our main timeline to kind of show the progress. Instead of using a regular rectangle tool like you might use, I'm going to use the pen tool to create a straight line, and that way we can animate it using the trim pass, which is just going to make it a little bit easier rather than playing around with the rectangle and stuff like that. So I've just found that that works the best. So we're going to start off just by, you can either hit Option and apostrophe, and that's going to bring up your grid, or you can go into this little thing here and show a proportional grid. And I'm just going to draw a line, click in one place, hold shift and click again, and that's going to create our little line, and then just hide the grid again. And we want to expand the stroke a little bit to make it a little bit thicker so we can get a better sense of what it looks like and even add some text inside of it if we want to. Now I'm just going to select my layer and center it up. Name the layer. You can just name this phase line because we're going to be working with quite a few layers, so it's always nice to keep that in order. It's up to you how many splits you want in the phases. If you just want to do one long one, that's fine. You can do multiple smaller ones. Usually what I would want to do if I split it into smaller segments and want to divide them, you can add a trim pass and then just work with the percentages and then create gaps of, let's say, 5%. So if I add a trim pass and then go in, let's set the end to 20%, and then we can duplicate the phase line and just name it phase line 2 is fine, and then open up the trim paths in this one and set the start to 20 and the end to 100%. Then you can see it fills out the rest, and then let's say we want a 5% gap, so set the start to 25%, and that'll give us a little gap, and then we can continuously work through that, and that'll make sure that there's even spacing in between because we are working with percentages out of the whole line. So let's do a 2% gap, so let's set that to 22%. That just gives us a little bit of a gap, and then we can extend that. In this case, I just want it to be one pretty long one to begin and then a little one at the end, kind of like the example, because I feel like that would make pretty good sense because we have the production and then we have the end product that you make. So if we set the first one to, let's do 80%, and then the last one, start that at 81 and finish at 100%, and that's just gonna give us a nice little dash here. We can hit U to close up all those parameters because we're not going to be using them at this point in time. Now we can add some text. Let's do production. In this case, I am just going to be sticking using this Satoshi font, and I'm just going to change it to a off-white color. So scale that down, and I want to right align it, or left align it, sorry. I want to place it over here, just lining it up kind of with the edge of my little bar, and we can either place it above or you can place it inside depending on the look that you are going for. And I'm going to duplicate this text and I'm going to drag it over to line up with the second part, and we're just going to name this consumer. Now we can start adding our assets that we've gathered. So in my case, I'll go into my Finder and drag in my steps. I'm just going to drag and drop them. Make sure you either work with PNGs, or if you don't, you can always go into Photoshop and export them as PNGs. Once you've removed the background, it's just going to make your life a lot easier. And I've got a little folder structure here, so I'm just going to drag all of these into my assets folder to keep it nice and organized. Now, if we scale all of these down, I'm just going to hit S on all of these to scale them down a good bit. And now we want to line them up. So I've been so smart in advance, I've named them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to make it a little bit easier on myself. So we're going to start with 1, scale that one up a little bit and move it over to the left, and then the second one. And here I'm just trying to match the sizes visually, since all of them are kind of different scale depending on the image size and whatnot. Our images are pretty small compared to our lines, so we can always adjust that. So let's just select them all, scale them up a little bit, and move this over that way. We'll scale her down just a little bit and put it over here, and put my coffee machine there, scale that down a little bit also down a little bit, and I will select all of them and move them down ever so slightly. I want both of these images to be in the consumer part, so I'm just going to adjust our line a little bit. So if you open up the parameters for it and go into the trim paths, we can adjust where we want it to be. So I'm just going to decrease the end until right about 68 looks pretty good. And then I'm going to set the start of the other one to 69 to give us that little bit of gap, and maybe even move it up to 70 and then 69 for the first one. Just trying to get it to be right in between these two. So it's just kind of playing around until you get something that looks pretty good. And I think that works pretty well. And then take my consumer text and move it over. We can take the second part of the line and we can change its color. Let's do a bluish color maybe. Now that we've got it all laid out, we can start animating it. First thing we're going to do is animate the lines, which is going to be pretty simple. Again, we're going to be using the trim paths. So open those back up. Let's start with our green line here. We will keyframe the end, drag that forward. Let's move the keyframe to about 1 second, then go all the way back and set that end to 0. And we will do the same thing with the second line and just set that to 71 to match exactly what that is. And that's just going to make sure that we don't have that line going in all the way behind. Just like that, we've animated the two lines, but of course we want the green one to hit the blue before the blue comes in. So we're just going to select these two, ease them using sexy speed. As soon as the green starts to come to a slowdown, we're going to take these keyframes and move them up just as that happens, and then we'll get a nice little two-piece animation that's going to animate in, and then the other one, and it's just going to make it a little bit nicer to have them sequence rather than having them both come out at the same time. That's pretty much it for the animation of this stroke itself, and that's why I like using a stroke instead of a rectangle. Just makes it a little bit easier to animate. Now we want the text. For this, we're going to keep it super simple. We're just going to do a simple position animation. So just hit P to bring up the position once you have your text layer selected. Go to about 3 seconds, keyframe that, go back 12 frames to about 2 seconds and 12 frames, and then drag them down into the boxes. Select both of them, and in this case I'm going to use a fast in preset that I have in my flow. So apply that and we'll trim the layers right as the first keyframe shows. We can take them and either place them underneath our layers or simply use the stroke as a track map. So let's say we have the production, we want that set to the green one, so set that to that, and then the consumer set to phase 2, and make sure to re-show these two layers. And then you of course want to make sure that you invert them, otherwise they'll only show inside. And just like that, we have this nice little reveal. Another thing that's pretty nice is staggering these. So let's say we want the first one to come in right about here, and then the other one come in as our blue line comes in. Just like that, we have our little text animation. For these, I like to keep it pretty simple. The main thing I like to do with these is adding a scale animation. So selecting all of them, then hitting S to bring up the scale. I'm just gonna go forward to about 4 seconds, keyframe all of those, go back to about 3 seconds and 12 frames, so 12 frame animation, and set all of them to 0. Select them all, and then add a sexy speed. And to add a little bit more flair to this scale animation, we are going to be adding the inertial bounce. So if you've watched many of my other videos, you already know what it is. It's a super nice expression that just adds a little bit of bounce to the end of the animation. Just easier than animating it yourself, because mathematics are there for a reason, right? Once you have the expression copied, you want to alt click on one of them and then Command V. And then you can just right click on the scale and then copy expression only and paste it onto all the other ones. And that's just gonna give us a nice little bounce, but we don't want them all to come in at the same time. Select all of them, and I'm gonna use motion tools to offset them. So let's do an offset of 10 frames and then sequence them with our first one coming in first. So we wanna make sure that the staircase is going down because that's the layer sequence. And then just hit sequence, and that will sequence all the keyframes, and then we can move it up forward, and playing that back, we have something that looks kind of like this. Pretty clean little animation. Additionally, I want to add a little arrow showing the process. So we are gonna go zoom in a little bit, and we will change the preview to 4 just so we can see a little bit better what we're doing. And I'm gonna select my pen tool, and I'm just gonna set the stroke color to the same color as our text, and decrease the width, the stroke width to like 5 pixels. I'm gonna click and hold shift while I place my other point to create a straight line, and maybe even decrease the width of it a little bit to something like 3, because we don't want it to be too big and bulky. That'll be our base of our arrow. And then hit G again to bring up your pen tool again while having nothing selected. We're just gonna click at the very top, and then you can create an arrow either by going straight if you like that look, or click and then drag out while holding shift will create a little bit of a bendy arrow. I very much like bendy arrows just because I think they look a little bit cooler and they're so easy to make, so why not just adjust it to get it to look pretty good. And now we're going to be adding a trim pulse animation to animate the arrow. I'm going to start with the base, open that up and then hit trim pulse. You can either animate it going down or up, so that's just depending on how you like your arrows animated. I will animate it down, so if I set the start to 100, keyframe that, go forward about 12 frames, and then set that to 0. Select those keyframes, add sexy speed, and now we have our little bar coming down like that. And now we can animate the arrows themselves. Again, go in, add a trim pulse. In this case, I want my arrow to start animating from the top. We're just gonna be animating the end. So if I go back to right in the middle of our main base animation of the arrow, and keyframe the end and then just move that forward a little bit and then set that to 0. Select it and add a sexy speed. We're gonna get this nice little animation. We can even move it up a little bit more to get it to be a little bit more snappy. And we can just copy this trim pulse and add it to our second hand. And we of course want to line these keyframes up so that the arrow comes out at the same time. And maybe even move it over a little bit, just like that. Let's move the keyframes of the arrow back to right before our second one comes up. So keyframe it just like that, boom. And now we can take this and we can pre-comp it and just name this arrow pre and hit OK. And now we can duplicate it and move it every time a new one pops up. So let's duplicate it right here and move it over, just using your arrow keys and shift, and then drag it forward just a little bit so that it doesn't show up at the same time as our first arrow, but rather aligns with when our next element pops up. And we're just gonna repeat that until we have all the arrows we need. And just like that, we have sequenced our arrows to come out one by one as our individual items are coming in. I'm gonna select all my images. I'm gonna put them in a pre-comp, and I'm just gonna name this images phase pre and drag that into my pre-comps folder here to keep our files managed. Shout out Sky. And open that up, and we're going to be adding an adjustment layer, so add that option command Y, and we are going to add a hue saturation to it to get it to be black and white. I just like that look. You can always just add a tint or tritone if you want a more different look. Like let's add a tritone. It'll give it a nice sepia tone. Just match it to your project. You can even go crazy and do something like the green that we have. Really up to you. I like keeping it black and white. I do want to add an expression to the position just to give each one a little bit of wiggle. So if I open up P on each one just by hitting P and on a layer, alt click the position and then do a posterize time, set that to 6, and then a wiggle. We'll do 222,3, and that'll just give us a little bit of wiggle on it. And right click, copy expression and paste it onto all of them, and that's just going to give us a little bit of visual texture. If I go back into our original little composition here, we can add a posterized time. So again, add an adjustment layer, add posterized time, set that to something like 12, add another adjustment layer and add a transform to get some overall jitter. And we're just gonna set the scale to 101, alt click the position again and do the same expression as we did on the individual items. Just like that, we have a nice little jittery animation in here, and you can always mess with the parameters to get the look that you kind of want. Increase it, decrease it to your liking. A final touch to this could be adding a simple background. If you just select all your layers, pre-comp it and just name this phase pre. Make sure you drag that into your pre-comps folder, and we'll add a solid. Let's do a whitish. We will have to change our text color, so just select your text and just change it to a darker color, like a dark green color here. And we can go back in, open up your grid, center that up pretty good. Now I'm gonna add another layer, and we're gonna name this grid, and we're gonna add the grid effect to it. Let's do a bluish color maybe to get like some school paper looking thing, pretty faint. And we are gonna adjust the grid to be small squares and decrease the border to something like 2. And now we have a school looking paper type thing, which I just think looks pretty good, especially in this scenario. It gives it more of like a textured feel. But that is pretty much it for the phase animation. Now we can hop onto the box chart, which is super simple. This one you can design in After Effects if you want to, but I actually prefer doing this one in Illustrator. It just makes it a little bit easier lining everything up compared to After Effects. So in Illustrator, we are gonna start by hitting P to bring up our pen tool, and I'm just gonna draw a straight line once again. So just shift and click to get a straight line. and we're going to increase the width of it just a little bit, center it up, and then we're going to be creating little box plots for the box charts, but we're going to use the pen tool again to draw a stroke, so we can use the trim paths to animate it instead of the rectangles. So again, we'll hit P, click anywhere you want really, and just hold shift while going up, and then we can increase it to get a box looking shape. We'll put it right at the bottom and it'll line it up for us. You can alt click and hold shift and drag to duplicate it, then hit A. You can move the end path of it a little bit to get some variation. Alt shift click again to drag it out. You still use an A, you can just drag that down, and you can select all of them just by clicking and dragging, and then clicking on the little 3 boxes in the align tool. If you don't have it, go into window and then align, that'll bring that up, and then you can distribute them evenly, and we'll just place them right in the middle just like that, and we can decrease that and select it and center it up. And let's drag it down a little bit, and now we can add some text. So just go to your text tool, and then let's do $500 million. That seems reasonable. Change the font. Let's do a Satoshi to match, increase that a little bit and kind of line it up with that. You can change the color of this later on. We don't need to worry about that right now. Alt click and drag it down, and let's do 350, drag that down, and let's do 100 and drag this down. Let's make this a lot smaller just to exaggerate a little bit, and we'll change that to 5M. We can select all of these text layers, and I'm going to choose to right align them just because I think that'll look a little bit nice in this instance, and move them a little bit to the side. And just like that, we have designed our box chart. With it designed, you just want to select it all, and then I'm going to use the overlay plugin to send it to After Effects. Then I'm going to select my main shape and use the motion tools plugin to extract it. You can also do this with the overlay plugin, but it's just easier, it's right there. And we can't see anything because it's all black, so we can just select all our shapes and remove the fill from them and change the stroke to a nice orange yellowish color, and we can change all the text to a whitish color. We are just gonna take a trim paths and animate that. So add a trim paths to one of your shapes, animate the end position. So keyframe it, move the keyframe forward a little bit, and then set it to 0 right at the beginning. You can select it and add a sexy speed, just select your trim paths and add it to all the other shapes. And if you hit U, we now have animated all of them. Now we want to stagger them. We can use the motion tools plugin, and this time we want it to go the opposite way because our first shape is at the bottom of like the group stack. And sequence them, let's do 10 frames again. Next up is the text, and what I like to do for this is also just a very simple position slide animation. You can either do it from down and slide it up or slide in. In this case, let's do a slide in. So just go to about 3 seconds, keyframe it, go 12 frames back, move it to the left, select all your keyframes, and then do a fast in. We can just trim all these layers right at the beginning and sequence them by, let's do 10. So this time the opposite way because 500 is at the top. Sequence that and move it to the very beginning, and that should line up with when each one comes in. Now we still want to animate the bottom line, so add a trim paths to it. And the reason I'm not copying and pasting is because we want to do it a little bit differently for this one. So adding a trim paths, we're going to set both of these parameters to 50, and that's just going to make it animate from the middle. So keyframe both of these and move forward about 12 frames and set the first one, aka the start, to 0 and the end to 100. Select both of them, add a sexy speed, and just like that we have it animating out, and then all our animation comes in. This is pretty basic. You can add a little bit more to it if you wanted to add like a grid for some context, we can do that. So add a grid effect once again, solid, add the grid and move it behind, and let's scale it down to fit, just make it a little bit skinnier, set that to about 2, lining up with the top of that one, and then make it a little bit narrower to get the square look. And then we can take our shape tool, remove the stroke from it, add a fill. You want the fill to be a pretty crazy color just so you can see what you're kind of doing, and then from the beginning of it, click and drag until you've covered the whole chart. And then we can use this as a track mat for our grid. So select your grid and then pick whip the track to that, and now we have a little isolated grid. And you can always change the size of the grid since we've used the track mat, so you can unlink that, increase that to the sides if you want, move it over a little bit. You can always go in and change. Let's say you wanted it to be a little bit more faint, or you want to change the color, you can do that. Maybe like a slight grayish color. The final detail I want to add to this box shot is a post-process time. So I'm just going to take the post-process time from our first animation and copy that layer over and paste it in there. And that's just going to give it a little bit of extra visual niceness. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You can design this all you want and really change it up and make it look pretty cool. You can even add the arrow. So let's go into our pre-comp, add the arrow in there, place it underneath the adjustment layer, move that over this way, and maybe even rotate it to point down at the bottom one. Let's say we want to point out this little one down here. So playing that back, we have a nice little animation with an arrow pointing down, add some text, add some sources, add some detail. Next up is the pie chart, and this is a little bit different. I used to use just the ellipse tool to make them, and that would always be a bit of a hassle, but we're actually gonna use the stroke of this. So I've got the stroke selected. If you only have the fill selected, you wanna go in, remove that, and then only add a stroke. And you wanna hold shift while drawing out a little ellipse or a circle, and you wanna center that up. And now you want to play around with the stroke until you have a circle that's fully closed. So you want to play around with the size and the stroke, because the smaller the circle is, the less stroke you'll need. So you have to play around a little bit to get the look that you kind of want. But let's say this is pretty good right here. And again, we want to add a trim paths to this. So adding a trim paths is going to allow us to animate certain percentages of the circle. So if you only wanted a piece, a cutout that was, let's do 18%, just like that, we've got it, but we still need the rest of it. So we're gonna duplicate our shape right here and drag it underneath, and we're just gonna name this base pie. We're gonna name this pie slice, and we're gonna change the color of the base to be maybe a blue color. And we can open up the trim paths. We will set the end to 100 and then the start to 18%. So now if we hide our slice, you can see it's the exact cutout. We might want to change this color because I don't like this color combination a whole bunch. So maybe like a purplish color right there, looks pretty good. Now we want to animate it. We're going to start with our main piece, go to about 1 second, keyframe both the start and the end, and go back to the beginning and set both of them to 0. So if I hide my pie slice, we've got this little animation here, which looks pretty smooth. We can go in and animate our pie slice as well in the trim paths properties. So open up that, make sure that's open, and then we're gonna set a keyframe at the end for 18%, and at the beginning, just set that to 0%. Select all your keyframes, add flow, 60 speed in this case, play back, and we've got this nice little pie slice animation. We can add some extra source to it, so make sure the anchor point is in the center. And we can go in and add a little position animation to our slice. So let's hit P to bring up the position, keyframe that, go forward a little bit, and just using my arrow keys, I'm just gonna slide it out a little bit like a pizza slice. Select those keyframes, add some 60 speed to it, and move them up so that right after the circle comes to a complete stop, we have this little pie slice coming out. And we can add a little bit of text to it as well. 18% of all coffee beans, and we'll scale that text down a little bit to fit our pie chart. Place it right here. We will add a little bit of position animation. In this case, I'm just going to select my text and I'm going to use decompose text, which I believe is free. It'll be linked in the description, and set it to words and then original position using expressions, and hit decompose. Then delete our first little layer down here. Select all your layers, hit P to bring up the position, keyframe it, go back a little bit, and drag them down. And then we're gonna add the fast in preset I have over here. And we're just gonna cut all the layers to start right where the keyframe is, select them, and using Motion Tools, which is a free plugin, linked in the description, we're gonna offset them by 2 and make sure it's a downwards ladder, hit sequence, and place them right after it comes up. Super simple, super easy. You can even add the arrow that we had before. Last step is just to add a little bit of jitter to it, post-process time of course. So I'm just gonna select both those layers from in here that we've already get set up nice and easy for us, paste them in there, and just like that, we have a pie chart animation. So super simple, it doesn't get much easier than this. You can make more slices. It's super easy to calculate as well because you already have the percentages built into the trim path, so you don't have to think very much. Next up is the pyramid, which is something I didn't do until very recently, but I liked it, and it's super nice to get a little bit more of a visual way of showing levels, kind of like the food pyramid. But going into Photoshop, I already have my pyramid fit photo dragged in, just found one on Google, and I'm gonna hit P to bring up my pen tool, and I'm just gonna mask out this pyramid, which should be fairly simple. I'm not gonna be too picky about this, just getting the general shape of it. And once I have it all selected, I'm gonna right click, make selection, hit enter, and then use my masking tool to remove all that background, but still make it editable. I'm gonna right click on my layer and convert to smart object, and I'm just gonna hit V, Command A, and straighten it up, or center it up, I should say. Now we want to split this into a couple of different layers. In this case, I'm just gonna do 3. You can do however many you want. The good thing about this is we have some guidelines as to how the perspective works, which is gonna make it a little bit easier on us. So I'm gonna hit L to bring up my pen tool, or my lasso tool, sorry. And let's click down here and just use those lines a little bit to guide us. And that is pretty good. And mask around, and then once I've closed it, right click, layer via copy. So now we have this, which will be our base layer. Hide that, show our pyramid again. And now I want to go up a little bit further. Let's do right about here, looks pretty cool. And drag that down to match until you get a line that matches, and just select all the way around it. And then right click, layer via copy. And now if we hide our main pyramid, I can command click my base layer, and that'll select it. And then I'm going to use a mask, and then hit Command I to invert that mask, and now we have our middle piece. So we have bottom and middle piece. And since we already have everything else cut out and we just need this last one, I can Command click on the middle one, just use that as my mask, and then invert it. So just like that, we have the top bit for itself, the middle bit, and the base. I'm just gonna name this middle layer and top layer, and turn them into smart objects so we don't have that layer mask with it. Next step is I like to add a little bit of depth to it, because if we close this up, for example, you can see that it kind of looks like there should be something inside. We don't want it to just be hollow. So create a new layer underneath the layer itself, hit L to bring up your lasso tool, go to one corner, and kind of imagine what you think it would look like inside in terms of the angle and perspective, and then select the color that you think would look pretty good. In this case, I know I'm going to be turning it black and white, so I'll mainly focus on the brightness of the background. If you are working in color, you want to work a bit more, getting the right colors, gradients, maybe even really play around with it. But I think this will be pretty good. And just Command Delete, make sure it's selected as your back. You can hit X to switch between them. That's it for that layer. I'm going to select them, right click, and convert to smart object. And we're going to do it with the top layer as well. The base layer we don't need because it would be covered up in terms of perspective. So create another layer and hit L to bring up your little pen tool and go like that. Looks pretty accurate. And then drag your layer above it and select them both, convert to smart object, and just like that we have a layered pyramid. So we're going to save it, and we are going to go straight into After Effects, and I'm just going to drag in my PSD that we've saved into our After Effects composition. Hit OK. Open that up until you get your layers, Command C those, and then drag them in or paste them into your composition. Now we can start animating them. So I want it to start off as a regular pyramid, and then I want it to spread apart to reveal the layers in between the pyramid. So hitting P, I'm gonna set a keyframe right at the beginning, go forward a little bit, and then the top layer, I'm gonna drag down a little bit, and the bottom layer, I'm gonna drag up a little bit. And that's just gonna give us a little bit of anticipation for the spread, where I'm gonna go forward a bit more than the space between the first two keyframes, and then give us some good spacing in between. Just drag them up close to the top and bottom of the scene. We don't need the keyframe on the middle one. Select those keyframes, pick a sexy speed, and play it back. Just like that, we've got a nice little animation there. But as you can see, it's a little bit too harsh right there. So we can select our keyframes, go into our graph editor and open that up. And then we can just drag these up, which is just make the movement a little bit smoother. You can always play around with the velocity of it. So let's say we want it to be a little bit quicker in the beginning and then ease in. Like that looks pretty good. And of course we can add some inertial bounce to it as well, just to exaggerate that movement as well. So go into your first composition, or use the expression if you've got it copied, and go into images, and then right click on the scale, copy expression only, and then add that to your pyramid. We copied this in the wrong one. Great job. So I'm just gonna copy these and paste them in here and delete that. I want to add some text in between these layers, so I'm just gonna create a text. Let's do level 2 up here and center that up, and duplicate that, drag it down and name it level 1. Make sure that is centered as well. And we're gonna take these two layers and drag them below our pyramid, and then we'll cut them right here so that they are revealed by the pyramid spreading apart, and boom, we've got some text. I'm gonna add an adjustment layer and add some hue and saturation because I do want it to be black and white. So I'm just gonna do that and then add a levels to mess around with the contrast a little bit because it is a little bit too dark for me. So I'm just gonna play around with that until I get something that looks pretty cool. Boom. Now I'm gonna take these layers and I'm gonna pre-comp them, and I'm just gonna name this pyramid pre. And layer management, we are gonna drag that into our pre-comps folder. Now I want to add a little bit more spice to it, mess around with the composition a little bit. So right here, as it splits up, I want to use this motion to transition. Right here, I'm gonna split the layer, and I'm gonna take this second split, scale it up, and position it over to the side, just about right here. Right now, it's a pretty rough cut. We've got a little bit of the movement, which helps it, but what we can do is add a little bit more movement to help sell the effect. So we're gonna use the position animator. I'm gonna keyframe it to both, and for the second layer, our second split, I'm gonna move the first keyframe forward, and then I'm gonna go right to where it splits. So on the top layer, which is our second split, I'm gonna drag it down and move it back to that first keyframe here, and then I'm gonna go, and with our first layer, I'm gonna drag that up and move it over to where our second keyframe is, so that we've got an upwards flowing movement. So playing that back, we now have a little bit of extra movement that helps sell that cut. Basically, a match cut using movement. We can add a little bit of source to it, so take your posterized time, paste it in there, and just like that, we've got a nice little movement. And you can even take, let's say we want to show the second layer, add another position keyframe, go forward a little bit, and then drag it down so we can see the second level. Select those, add 60 speed, make sure it's still selected, and just like that, we've got a nice little animation. Last but not least, we have the map animation, which I bet a bunch of you are gonna enjoy because I always get requests about map animations. This time, we are gonna be dragging in this little asset that I've found, which is a super large map scan, which is awesome. It's 9,786 by 6,300, which is super big. We're gonna start out by pre-comping this, so I'm gonna hit Shift-Command-C to pre-comp it. And we wanna make sure that we leave all attributes in this composition. And we're just gonna name this map pre, and make sure that it goes in our pre-comps folder. Now we can open up our map here, and as you can see, it is very large, so it might be a little bit slower in some instances, so we might have to drop down the resolution sometimes to work with it because it is that big, but we need the size for the animations that we're gonna be doing. First thing I'm going to be doing is adding an adjustment layer. So adding a hue and saturation to make it black and white, and a little bit of levels to adjust the contrast just a little bit. That looks pretty darn good. Now we can add the other assets that I want to add to this. I've already found the assets that I want, so I'm just going to select them all and drag them in. I have a couple images generated by Adobe Firefly and then some other assets I found on Google. We can go into our project, and I'm just going to take all my assets and drag them into the assets folder just to make it a little bit more organized and easier to find later down the line. I'm actually going to delete this tape because I don't think I want it. I'm going to take the 3 pictures and drag it below our thumbtack and Polaroid and make sure the thumbtack is at the very top. I'm going to take my Polaroid frame and scale it up and move it down a little bit until it covers our photo. And then I'm going to take the thumbtack and drag it up and maybe even rotate it just a little bit to get that shadow looking kind of how I want. And we can always open our grid in proportional grid to make sure that our thumbtack is lined up towards the center to make sure everything is nice and centered there. The thumbtack looks a little bit small, so I'm just going to scale that up a little bit. And we need to make a couple of duplicates, 2 to be exact, for each photo, and the same with the thumbtack. And I'm just gonna organize it so that they all are together. So France layers, let's turn those aqua, I guess. Asia with a Polaroid frame and a thumbtack, we will change that to green. And America, we will make fuchsia. This is just gonna make it a little bit easier, and it's always good to stay organized. I am gonna take my Polaroid and photo, and I'm gonna pre-comp them and just name them America Polaroid. And then we are gonna take the anchor point, so hit Y to move the anchor point and move it up to match with the thumbtack, because we are gonna be creating a slight sway for each of the photos. And we're just gonna repeat that process for all the photos. Now that we have that pre-comp, we can select both our layers, so the thumbtack and the Polaroid layer, and create a void or a null. Void is a free plugin, link will be in the description, and that's just gonna make it a little bit easier for us to move it around. So if I hit P and S to bring up the position and scale after with my void selected, we can now move it wherever we want. So let's take this America one, scale it down a little bit, and then we are gonna move it out left to be where America is, which is currently hidden by all of these, and we can do the same with the Asia and the France. Now that we have our Polaroid photos laid out, we can add that little movement that I was talking about earlier. It's a very simple wiggle expression, pretty similar to what we made earlier. So if we just go into one of the pre-comps, let's take the France pre-comp, hit R to bring up rotation, then Alt click the rotation and add a wiggle. Let's do 1,10. And that's just gonna give us a little bit of wiggle. As you can see, it's just a slight sway. You can even decrease the frequency of it a little bit. So set it to like 0.5, 10, which is just gonna make it a little bit slower. Then you can right click on that, copy the expression and just paste it onto the rotation of the other two. And just like that, you have some movement with those. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, so far, there's not much info other than just having the Polaroid photos on there, which is cool if you're trying to make a travel map, but we can add a little bit more specificity to it. Let's say we want to add a little location marker. Let's do a light blue color and then highlight where we've actually been. So in this case, let's zoom in and around Paris, we're just gonna mark that. I'm gonna remove the stroke and add a fill. We can maybe increase the scale of this a little bit and then set it to multiply and put it below everything, but right above the adjustment layer. So we've got this nice little highlight. Duplicate this, scale it up a little bit maybe, and move it over to America, where, let's see, where have we been? Maybe we've been to New Orleans, so we will move that out a little bit to the right and up as such, and we can duplicate that again and drag it over to Asia somewhere. That's right where we've been, that's right. So that almost serves kind of like a heat map or like an area map, which is pretty cool to add some context to the photos or whatever data you have on there. We can go ahead and add some borders as well if we want to do that. So let's take America, for example. I'm just gonna solo it, so it's a little bit easier for us to see what we're doing. And we're just gonna go around the border of America. So I'm just gonna draw around here. And you of course wanna be a little bit more specific with this, but it's not too important either because we are just trying to create a little bit of a highlight effect. I'm gonna decrease that a little bit and maybe change the color to a nice yellow orangish color. And again, we're gonna set it to multiply and we can unhide that so we can see everything together. Put that underneath it all, right above the adjustment layer, of course, because we don't want it to be black and white as well. And then we can add a trim path if we want to animate that. So add a trim path, set a keyframe for the end, move it forward a little bit, and then set it to 0. Select it, add some easing to it, and just like that, we've got a nice little map animation, a map border animation, I should say. That is the basics of the map. We've set it up now. This is where you can add all your little details, your text elements and whatnot. If we go back to our actual composition, this is where we're gonna animate the actual map and kind of see where it is. That's why we kept all the attributes in here so that we have all the space to work with and just make it a little bit easier when we animate. So if I go to the very beginning, I'm gonna turn the layer into a 3D layer. You don't have to, you can keep it as a 2D, and I'm gonna select classic 3D, and then I'm gonna open the position and the rotation. And I'm just gonna take this position and I'm gonna scale it out until we can see the full map, just because I like to start it that way with a little bit of context. Keyframe the position and the orientation, and then go forward. Let's go about 2 seconds forward, set that to 0, the Z position, and then we can move in. And let's say we wanna start with the Asia area, and I'm gonna zoom in even a little bit more and maybe even tilt it a little bit away and lay it flat, bada bing, bada boom. Then let's go forward another 2 seconds. And now we're gonna move it over and maybe tilt it to be more straight on, but lay it down more, and then adjust the Z rotation and have that be placed right there. Go another 2 seconds and move it out even more left to where we have the American map and tilt it maybe a little bit away, less length, less flat, adjust like that and move it over. And then we can go into the pre-comp and we want our outline to come in right about here. So I'm just gonna open it up and move the keyframes to be over this way. If we select all our keyframes and then hit sexy speed, we're gonna get a nice little animation. And just like that, we have a nice little animation that moves from one place to the next. And it looks super cool. One thing I do want to add is a camera and mess around with the depth of field just to get a little bit more of that sexy in there. So I'm going to right click down in my composition, go to new, go to camera, and I'm going to select a 50mm camera, and then I'm just going to change the f-stop to something like 0.9 to get that really creamy depth of field. I'm gonna go into my 2 view mode, make sure I have left selected. If you don't see any of these options, or if you don't have the depth of field, make sure you're on classic 3D for the renderer. You can always hit Command K to bring up your composition settings, and make sure you have classic 3D selected in your 3D renderer. Now we can open up the camera and camera options, go to the very beginning and set a keyframe for the focus distance. And now we want to make sure that we have our focus distance line dragged all the way out, which is very far up there. We can just copy that and paste it in there, and that'll put it pretty close. It's getting there, and just like that, it should be in focus because we have it lined up right there. Then we're going to move forward and let's set it to 0. That'll make it a little bit easier for us. So take that and make sure that is in focus, and then we can go forward to the next. That looks pretty good. We can go forward and again adjust until we have it in focus. We can increase the aperture if you want more depth of field, so really shallow, and then change the iris shape to something like hexagon for a little bit more of a pleasing image. Select them all and match the easing. Go back to 1 view mode, fit, and let's play it back. So we've got this nice little animation. We've got some really nice depth of field where it just looks buttery smooth. And that is pretty much it for the 5 different types of infographic animations. We did a phase, we did a box chart, we did a pie chart, all super analytical. We got the pyramid, which is a little bit more theoretical almost, I want to call it. And then we have the map, which, well, you can use for so many different things. You can even use it for something like, you can show the transportation from, it goes from one country to the next. You can add ships, photos, etc. You can do heat maps to show population densities, etc. I mean, it is endless of opportunities out there, but I figured I'll just give a quick breakdown of a couple of different animations that I use quite often and that are useful and how I go about animating them. But that'll be all for this video. I just want to say thank you, and I'll see you again next week. Peace out.